During a special address at the World Economic Forum, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng called for greater cooperation and dialogue and warned against trade wars.
We should firmly support free trade and jointly promote a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization. Economic globalization, driven by international specialization, collaboration, complementary strengths, and the pursuit of win-win, is a prevailing trend of history. It has benefited many countries, including China, and enabled them to achieve fast development. On the contrary, tariff and trade wars have no winners. Beyond driving up costs for production and trade, they fragment the world economy and disrupt the global distribution of resources.
The speech also detailed China's economic progress, highlighting the country's efforts to boost domestic demand and further open up. For more on the World Economic Forum, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Berlin, Germany, is Ulrich Bruckner. He's a professor of European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. Also with us from New York, Anthony Chan is a former chief economist for JP Morgan Chase & Company. From Beijing, Qiang is the assistant director of the International Monetary Institute at Renmin University. And Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. He too joins us from Beijing. Thanks everyone for joining us. Victor, the theme at this year's annual meeting in Davos is a spirit of dialogue. And as we just heard there in that keynote speech, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng called for greater cooperation and discussed the importance of multilateralism. This is a huge gathering, a big gathering. We see world leaders there, corporate leaders, business leaders, representatives of some of the main think tanks around the world. How important is it for China to use this as an opportunity to convince the world that multilateralism, globalization, and cooperation is the way to move ahead?
Thank you very much. The ongoing Davos meeting is a very important occasion for China to declare to the whole world that free trade in the world needs to be defended, because the world is at a crossroad. You have countries which are against free trade. They want to have fair trade. But I've emphasized that without free trade, there will be no fair trade. So China now has become the real standard bearer of free trade. And Vice Premier He Lifeng declares that we need to really defend free trade. Now, allow me to emphasize, by defending free trade, China is not only defending its own legitimate interests, it is actually defending the legitimate interest of mankind and all countries in the world. And amazingly, China is also helping defending the legitimate interest of the American people, because free trade, in real essence of the word, is a benefit for everyone involved in free trade. We should never allow free trade to be sabotaged, and we should not allow other countries to weaponize tariff or trade for its own purposes rather than generating benefits for mankind as a whole. Therefore, I think Ms. Vice Premier He Lifeng's speech is very important, because it outlines for the benefit of mankind that China defends free trade.
And Victor, as you say, this is not only important for China, but for the rest of the world as well. Do you believe that China has the support of the majority of countries around the world in its quest to bring multilateralism back?
Absolutely. I think every country in the world should pause and think about whether free trade is the highway and the better way going forward, because most of the countries in the world, almost without exception, including, ironically, the United States, have actually engaged in free trade over the past several years and decades, especially after the end of the Second World War. And there is only one country, the United States, which now wants to weaponize tariff or weaponize trade. But I don't think it will prevail, because if the reciprocal tariff war, as the Americans called it, eventually will antagonize mankind as a whole, it will turn all the other countries on to the other side of the equation. And I think all countries will realize that free trade works for everyone's benefit. And free trade is something worthwhile for all us to fight for and to defend, even for the American people, because I truly believe the American people do not want to have tariff imposed by the American government, which will need to be paid by the American people themselves.
Okay, Qiang, let's look at what the Chinese economy is looking like right now. The Chinese Bureau of Statistics announced on Monday that the country did meet its annual growth target of 5% and surpassed the 140 trillion yuan threshold for the first time. So what does that tell you about the Chinese economy right now?
Well, that shows us a very clear message, and Chinese economy is large, stable, and resilient. We're looking at an economy with 1.4 billion in population. This is kind of a phenomenon, kind of modernization, which has never been achieved in the history of the human being. Just remember, is there any one time an economy with 1.4 billion population has been reaching such a high standard of economic development and living standard averagely? I don't think so. And I think China is doing that, and Chinese people is marching towards that kind of goal. And I think that actually been containing several factors to achieve that. Number one is that I think the leadership is absolutely doing the right thing, march towards, not only the benefit of Chinese people, and also as what Victor just mentioning, we've been trying to, serve the whole world market, try to be the value anchor of all, the world market, make sure that supply chain is stable. Especially we're coming towards, these beginning of the new year, and I think this is absolutely very important to see that of all kinds of holidays. We want to make sure that children will have toys on their table, and all the kinds of prices can be stable. And secondly, I think China is continuing opening up to the whole world when half of the world is shutting down itself towards, the other half of the world, trying to impose tariffs and also make their own people pay more for the services actually they try to buy from a more efficient market. Now China want to, not only try to, make sure that this border has been opening up toward the world market, but also make sure that the whole domestic market in China will buy in more of the things from the world, so that this kind of a large market will actually become the very, very important dynamics and powerhouse of the whole world economy. And also, thirdly, I think is an empowerment of the global South nations, especially in the global South orders and also, high technologies. On one hand, China really want to make sure that global South nations do have a say in this kind of a multilateral platforms, to make them more representative for the global South nations. But on the other hand, China also want to make sure that, all kinds of these renewable energies, AI, and all these high technologies can really benefiting all the global South nations instead of being monopolized by only a few nations. So I think through all these ways, China is not only trying to make its own economy bigger, but also try to make the whole world economy, more stabler. Because China understands this is just two sides of one coin. If we can balance this two development, we're like walking forward with two legs, one forward, another forward later. If you cripple one leg, the other leg will fall, immediately, as you can understand from the picture.
Ulrich Bruckner, the Davos Forum this year is taking place against the background of the rising tensions we see between the United States and Europe over President Trump's push to acquire Greenland. Now, the Europeans are calling for talks. They believe that there is some way out of this, a diplomatic way, which could mean that the Americans could have a greater presence in Greenland, short of the country losing its sovereignty. But the Europeans have also said that they can react forcefully if President Trump continues with this. In fact, President Trump is threatening to impose 10% tariffs on European countries, including Germany. And of course, these are all NATO allies. Let's listen to what the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, had to say.
We
do not want this escalation. We do not want a trade dispute with the United States of America. But if we are confronted with tariffs that we consider inappropriate, then we are in a position to respond. And that is precisely what we will be discussing in Brussels on Thursday.
So, Ulrich, European leaders say that the tariffs would undermine transatlantic relations. It would affect trade a lot. And, of course, there's a trade agreement between the EU and the US, and that would be undermined as well. So what are Europe's options right now?
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more to what the first speaker said about the benefits of free trade and that we have to defend multilateralism because this is beneficial for everyone involved. The European Union as such is a practice of multilateralism, and so for them it's a very easy conclusion that what works in a region could also be beneficial for the world as a whole. When we look at the latest announcement of tariffs imposed on 8 European countries, some are members of the European Union, others not, then this is an abuse of an instrument in trade negotiations that are simply used as a punishment, as a torture instrument in a toolbox of an imperialist attack on a partner. This is not an enemy, but the European Union, for what it stands for, as a value-based liberal concept that we thought belongs to the DNA of the Western world, is now lectured since last year at the Munich Security Conference that we do not share the same values as the current administration in the White House. And so everyone was very concerned for a whole year, and the EU was very careful in actions and rhetoric to avoid tensions that could turn into an escalation and a trade war. Now we have reached a point with the open announcement of annexing Greenland that NATO territory will be a subject of an annexation by a NATO member, that trade policy is one thing, and the additional 10% on top of the asymmetric agreement that Ursula von der Leyen on behalf of the European member states have agreed would not cause a major economic crisis in the member states. But what we learn from game theory and watching mafia movies is that if you give in once, it only triggers appetite for more, and this should be fiercely rejected. So the EU will flex muscles economically and show their torture instruments, which is definitely not what anyone wants, but it seems as if this is the only language an aggressive American president understands.
Anthony Chan, those concerns that we heard there from the German Chancellor were also echoed by the French President, Emmanuel Macron. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Without collective governance, cooperation gives way to relentless competition. Competition from the United States of America through trade agreements that undermine our export interests, demand maximum concessions, and openly aim to weaken and subordinate Europe, combined with an endless accumulation of new tariffs that are fundamentally unacceptable, even more so when they are used as leverage against territorial sovereignty.
So, Anthony, there's a new report out by the United States-based Eurasia Group, which identifies the United States as the, quote, principal source of global risk in 2026. It's something you probably would never have seen 10, 15 years ago. But if Europe retaliates with tariffs, Forbes magazine reports that $108 billion in U.S. goods are on the line. So what is the potential economic fallout for the United States? How will it impact the economy here?
Well, on that so-called anti-coercive tool, if it is in fact dislodged, would be disastrous for the global economy. The IMF just raised global economic growth to 3.3% from 3.1%. That number would go in the other direction. Keep in mind, as Professor Gao mentioned earlier, the economics profession has been averse to these kinds of actions, tariffs and things like that, because for hundreds of years we've believed in the theory of comparative advantage. And this week, in fact, a think tank, the Kiel Institute, announced in a study that 96% of all the tariffs that were instituted by the United States were in fact paid for by U.S. Entities. That means either corporations or individuals. So even though it may seem as though it's a productive use of leverage to increase these tariffs, ultimately it's the country itself that actually suffers. And then the global economy, because if the country suffers and imports less, then that other country that was exporting exports less products. So the result is the domestic country imposing the tariff suffers, and the exporting country suffers, so ultimately the global economy suffers. So to answer your question, Anand, it would be disastrous for the global economy if it would escalate to that point, to use that very, very tumultuous tool that the Europeans don't want to use. But as you can see from the rhetoric, they would not be averse to using it if they don't think negotiations are possible.
All right, Victor, so while President Trump makes these threats and says that he will impose tariffs on countries that don't agree with what he wants to do, I mean, the world is moving on. Other countries move on. We just had a visit by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to China, and the two sides announced after that visit that they'd signed a trade deal that will allow Chinese-made electric vehicles to be exported to Canada. Canada says that it will take up to 49,000 of those vehicles initially. That will increase over time, and that they will reduce the current tariff to 6.1%. And China said that it would reduce tariffs on Canadian canola seeds in response to that. So how significant is this?
Prime Minister Carney's recent visit to China is a landmark event, is a turning point in China-Canadian relations. I hope Prime Minister Carney and the Canadian government and the Canadian people now have a chance to realize that China is not that of an enemy that the United States want them to believe in, and the United States under President Trump is not that much of a friend that the Americans want the Canadians to believe in, because I emphasized that the most important value for Canada now is to have their sovereignty and territorial integrity fully protected and respected by all the countries in the world, including its very important southern neighbor. Now, on the other hand, if China and Canada can get along with each other in the normal sense of the word, then the size of the Chinese market means that whatever Canada produces can be absorbed by the huge demand in China. And what's missing and what needs to be done is just to figure out enough wisdom between China and Canada to boost Canadian export to China. I've emphasized we need to reach several levels. First of all, Canada's export to China should be or surpass the Australians' export to China. Secondly, Canadian trade with China should achieve balanced trade, meaning Canada should not always have a trade deficit with China. And then the third target I want to emphasize, in my best view, Canadian export to China could triple in the coming years based on its current amount. That means between China and Canada, we are fast and quickly entering into a really fast track in boosting economic relations with each other for the benefit of the Canadian people as well as for the Chinese people.
Yeah. Ulrich Bruckner, we had another great example of the world moving on when we saw that the European Union had signed a major trade agreement with the South American group Mercosur that was signed in Paraguay. It paves the way for the EU's biggest trade deal in about 25 years. And this is what the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, said about that. Let's listen.
And this agreement sends a very strong message to the world. It reflects a clear and deliberate choice. We choose fair trade over tariffs. We choose a productive, long-term partnership over isolation. And above all, we intend to deliver real and tangible benefits to our people and our businesses.
So, Ulrich, we heard Ursula von der Leyen saying there that this sends a strong message to the world, but in effect, this is a strong message to Washington, isn't it?
Well, it is a strong message to Washington, and it is also a practical example of the commitment to multilateralism. I've been to people who do trade in the European Commission in December to get first-hand information about what they have in the pipeline. And they say that a number of countries or regional organizations are lining up to agree with the European Union on a free trade arrangement because this is their de-risking strategy to move away from asymmetric dependencies. And the European Union is trying the same thing. So Mercosur has been negotiated for more than 25 years, and now everyone couldn't wait to sign it, despite the problems for certain sectors. Farmers are a bit concerned, but the overall picture is in times like these, this is the only way of keeping our business model intact, which has always been based on the politics of freer trade.
Okay, Anthony, I want to turn now back to Davos. US President Donald Trump is traveling there with quite a big delegation. It includes the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, and the US Trade Representative as well. And I think this is the first time a US president is going to Davos since Bill Clinton went there. President Trump will lead that delegation. What are your expectations beyond Greenland, beyond the threats of tariffs, that the U.S. will propose at this conference?
Well, my expectation is that the same kind of rhetoric is likely to continue. The theme of this conference, of course, is the spirit of dialogue, but in reality what we're seeing is a one-way conversation between the United States and the rest of the world. And my expectation is that during the meetings, the United States will come to the realization that not only do we have to speak to other countries, but we also have to listen to other countries. And so I hope that somehow the result will be a better understanding between the United States and the rest of the world. And that, of course, front and center includes Europe, which is now at the front of all this chaos that's going on.
Ulrich, Bruckner, what are your expectations? Do you think that anything concrete will come out of this meeting, or will it be dominated totally by the Greenland issue? In fact, one of the major newspapers in the United States says that this meeting, which of course takes place every year, has now turned into what they called an emergency global summit.
Well, it certainly is an emergency global summit. And if you would have asked me about a year ago or before Trump came into office, if we would ever sit here and discuss this, I would have said this is beyond imagination and it will never happen, including looking at how the European Union came into being. Of course, it was with the help of the United States, and now the closest partners turn into enemies, and we are lectured how we should organize our internal debate and freedom of speech and so on. So if the outcome is that President Trump understands that Greenland cannot be sold or taken by force, with major consequences in the rest of the world, and it will practically mean the final end of NATO, although I would question that NATO is much more than an organization right now, given the fact that we heard a year ago that we are not worth being defended. So the whole concept of collective security doesn't exist anymore because deterrence is just a word, but it doesn't impress anyone. So the idea of a World Economic Forum to discuss the pressing problems of economic affairs is now secondary, and it's more about informing someone who feels like he can do whatever he wants, both domestically and is beyond the Constitution, and in a global order, is something that I would have never expected as a forum like the World Economic Forum to be.
Victor, one other point on the Chinese economy. The International Monetary Fund just raised its growth forecast for China to 4.5%. That's for this year, 2026. It cited lower U.S. tariffs and domestic stimulus measures. Now, since 2024, we've heard of the Chinese dual circulation strategy. It's rolled out this series of measures to boost consumer spending while at the same time expanding its international trade. How have these measures worked? And is there still more work to be done in spurring on domestic consumption?
Well, my personal reading is that the Chinese economy as it stands now is very much of a mixed nature. On the one hand, on the positive side, China emphasizes on what we call the new qualitative productivity. Why? What does it mean? It means China wants to achieve additional and greater efficiency and productivity through technological innovation. And I think China is really pushing to the very forefront, almost in all respects in this regard. And we expect that in the coming years and decades, a lot of increase in productivity and efficiency in China will be directly resulting from this new qualitative productivity. Right. That's for sure. That's the mega trend we should expect. On the other side, I think different economic sectors, different regions in China also suffer from a slowdown in the economic growth. Now, the bet right now is the newly achieved productivity and efficiency as a result of what we call new qualitative productivity should surpass the slowdown effect in some other sectors, in some regions in China. So overall, I think China's economy should be expected to continue to grow very vigorously and move very much quickly higher to the ladder of innovation and creativity in the coming years.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.